millionaire saw his pregnant ex-wife cleaning tables at his wedding reception. What he did next. Albert froze mid-kiss with his new bride when he spotted her across the ballroom. 7 months pregnant, on her knees scrubbing champagne stains from the marble floor. The baby was his. His wedding guests were celebrating. His mother was watching. And Violet, the woman he'd destroyed 18 months ago, was about to be fired by his new mother-in-law for looking unprofessional while carrying his child. He had 30 seconds to choose between his billion-dollar reputation and the only woman he'd ever truly loved. What happened next shattered 300 wedding guests and changed 2 lives forever. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story. Because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. The Crystal Ballroom of the Grand Meridian Hotel sparkled like a jewel box, every surface polished to perfection. Thousands of white roses cascaded from towering centerpieces, their petals scattered across tables draped in silk. The soft melody of a string quartet mixed with the gentle clink of champagne flutes and the refined laughter of Seattle's elite. Everything was perfect. Everything was exactly as Victoria had planned. Albert stood at the head table, his hand resting on the pearl-handled knife, the 3-tier cake before him a masterpiece of sugar and artistry. His new bride, Victoria Ashford, pressed close beside him, her designer gown rustling like whispered promises. Her diamond engagement ring, the one that had cost more than most people's homes, caught the light from the crystal chandeliers above. "Smile, darling," Victoria murmured, her perfectly veneered teeth gleaming for the photographer. "This moment needs to be perfect for the Times wedding feature." Albert forced his practiced smile, the one that had graced countless magazine covers and business journals. At 35, he was Seattle's youngest self-made billionaire, the tech genius who'd revolutionized digital security systems. Tonight, he was also the groom at what every society magazine would call the wedding of the decade. But something felt hollow in his chest, like an echo in an empty cathedral. The photographer's flash illuminated the scene. Albert Whitmore, impeccable in his custom Armani tuxedo, his dark hair perfectly styled, his green eyes reflecting the warm glow of success. Beside him, Victoria embodied everything his world expected. Blonde, beautiful, born into old money, with a family tree that traced back to the Mayflower and a trust fund that never questioned his ambitions. "Perfect couple," someone whispered from the crowd. "They look like they stepped off a magazine cover." If only they knew how true that was. Albert's gaze swept across the reception, taking in the faces of Seattle's power brokers, tech moguls, and social elite. These were his people now, had been for years. This was his world. Polished, pristine, profitable. So why did he feel like he was suffocating? Have you ever felt trapped in a life that looks perfect from the outside? Sometimes the biggest cages are made of gold. Share your thoughts below about what true happiness means to you. The cake cutting complete, Albert accepted congratulations from a parade of guests. Senator Morrison's firm handshake. Judge Patterson's hearty laugh. Tech rivals who smiled while calculating his net worth. Each interaction felt scripted, rehearsed, performed. Albert, my boy. His college fraternity brother, James, clapped him on the shoulder. "You did it, man. Victoria's a catch. Old money, new beauty, and those connections. Your stock portfolio must be doing cartwheels." Albert nodded, playing his part. But James's words stung in a way he couldn't name. When had love become a merger? When had marriage become a strategic acquisition? Victoria glided through the crowd like she owned it, which in many ways she did. Her family's pharmaceutical empire had influence in circles Albert was still trying to penetrate. Their union wasn't just romantic. It was dynastical. "She's perfect for you," his mother had said when he'd announced the engagement. "Finally, someone who understands our world." Our world. As if there were only one world that mattered. The music shifted to something slower, more intimate. Victoria appeared at his elbow, her manicured hand sliding through his arm. "Dance with me, husband," she said, the words still strange on her lips. They moved to the center of the marble dance floor, and the crowd formed a respectful circle around them. Albert held Victoria properly, precisely, the way they'd practiced with their choreographer. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Every step measured, every turn calculated. "You seem distracted," Victoria murmured against his ear, her breath smelling of champagne and mint. "Is everything all right?" "Just taking it all in," Albert replied, spinning her gracefully. The truth was more complicated. For months, he'd felt like he was living someone else's life, making someone else's choices. The engagement had felt inevitable rather than exciting, a logical next step rather than a leap of faith. But that was ridiculous. Victoria was everything a man in his position should want. Beautiful, accomplished, connected. She understood business dinners and charity galas, knew which fork to use at state dinners, could navigate boardroom politics as easily as she could plan a wedding. She was nothing like. Albert's thoughts stumbled, hitting a wall he'd carefully constructed 18 months ago. There were some memories too dangerous to revisit, some wounds too deep to probe, some people too painful to remember. The song ended, and the crowd applauded. Victoria curtsied playfully, her laugh musical and bright. "I'm going to powder my nose," she said, kissing his cheek. "Mingle with your guests, darling. Make sure old Mr. Henderson knows how grateful we are for his wedding gift." Albert nodded, watching his wife glide toward the ladies' room. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world, never questioned whether she belonged. He envied that certainty. "Quite a celebration," a voice said behind him. Albert turned to find Robert Chen, his business partner and closest friend, holding 2 glasses of whiskey. Robert was one of the few people who'd known Albert before the billions, back when they were coding in a garage and surviving on pizza and ambition. "Thanks for being my best man," Albert said, accepting the glass. "I know Victoria would have preferred someone more white and connected." Robert's smile was knowing. "Yeah, she made that pretty clear. But you chose me anyway." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the reception swirl around them. The staff moved like ghosts through the crowd, refilling glasses, clearing plates, adjusting flowers. Invisible people in an invisible world, the machinery that kept luxury functioning. "You happy, Albert?" Robert asked quietly. It was a simple question. It should have had a simple answer. Albert lifted his glass to his lips, the whiskey burning pleasantly down his throat. "I should be, right? This is everything I worked for. Success, status, security." "That's not what I asked." Before Albert could respond, a commotion near the kitchen doors caught his attention. A catering supervisor was speaking sharply to someone, her voice carrying just enough for him to catch fragments. "Told you to stay in the back. Guests might recognize. Can't have any complications tonight." Albert's focus sharpened. There was something familiar about the way the supervisor held herself, something that tugged at memories he'd buried. "I'll work harder," a voice replied, soft but steady. "I need this job." Albert's blood turned to ice. He knew that voice, had heard it whisper his name in the darkness, had listened to it sing in the shower, had memorized every inflection and cadence. That voice had once told him she loved him. That voice had once told him goodbye. Slowly, as if in a dream, Albert turned toward the sound. And there she was. Albert's whiskey glass slipped from his fingers, crystal shattering against the marble with a sound that seemed to echo through his entire being. The amber liquid spread across the pristine floor like spilled sunlight, but he barely noticed. His entire world had condensed to a single point of focus. There, 20 feet away, was the woman he'd tried to forget for 18 months. She was thinner than he remembered, her once vibrant curves softened by what looked like stress and exhaustion. Her beautiful dark skin, which used to glow with health and happiness, now carried a pallor that spoke of too many missed meals and sleepless nights. But it was unmistakably her. The same elegant neck, the same graceful way she moved even when she was on her hands and knees scrubbing someone else's mess. Violet Washington. The woman who'd walked out of his life with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart. The woman who was now 7 months pregnant. Albert's legs felt like water. The pregnancy was obvious despite the loose-fitting cleaning uniform she wore, a pale blue dress that had seen better days, with Emerald City Catering embroidered on the pocket. Her belly curved beneath the fabric in a way that made Albert's heart stop completely. 7 months. The timeline crashed through his mind like a freight train. 7 months ago, they'd still been together. 7 months ago, they'd been planning a future that had seemed as solid as the ground beneath his feet. 7 months ago, he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. Albert. Robert's voice seemed to come from very far away. You okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost. A ghost? Yes, that's exactly what Violet was. A beautiful, heartbreaking ghost from a life he'd convinced himself never existed. The catering supervisor was still berating her, her voice sharp with authority and barely concealed cruelty. I don't care what your personal situation is, Violet. You signed a contract agreeing to stay out of sight during events. The last thing we need is some guest recognizing you from before. As if Violet's previous life, their life together, was something shameful to be hidden away. I understand, Mrs. Henderson, Violet replied, her voice steady despite the humiliation. It won't happen again. I was just trying to clean up the spill before someone slipped. Mrs. Henderson. Albert's mind made the connection with sick clarity. Margaret Henderson, the wife of one of Seattle's most prominent real estate moguls. The same Margaret Henderson who'd once sat at their dinner table, laughing at Violet's stories about her work at the community center. The same woman who'd gushed about what a lovely couple they made. Now she was treating Violet like an inconvenience, a problem to be managed. Albert started forward without thinking, his body moving before his mind could catch up. But he'd only taken 2 steps when another figure appeared in his peripheral vision. Victoria was returning from the ladies' room, her smile bright and social as she navigated through their guests. In 30 seconds, maybe less, she'd be at his side. She'd see him staring. She'd follow his gaze. She'd see Violet. And then what? How do you explain to your new wife that your pregnant ex-girlfriend is scrubbing the floors at your wedding reception? Albert froze, trapped between 2 worlds, the gleaming, perfect world he'd built with Victoria, and the real, messy, authentic world he'd shared with Violet. For a moment that felt like an eternity, he stood paralyzed by the impossible choice. Violet must have sensed eyes on her because she looked up from the floor she was cleaning. Their gazes met across the crowded ballroom, and Albert watched as recognition dawned in her beautiful brown eyes. The same eyes that had once looked at him with such love, such trust, such hope for their future together. Now they were filled with something that made Albert's chest feel like it was caving in. Not anger. He could have handled anger. Not even hurt, though there was plenty of that. It was resignation. As if seeing him on his wedding day, married to someone else while she carried his child, was exactly what she'd expected from life. As if disappointment was such a familiar companion that this moment was just one more confirmation of what she'd always known to be true. You don't belong in his world, Violet. You never did. Albert could almost hear his mother's voice, The words she'd spoken 18 months ago echoing in the space between them. The words that had poisoned everything beautiful they'd built together. 4-3 heartbeats. They stared at each other across the vast distance of the ballroom. 3 heartbeats that contained 3 years of love, passion, fights, makeup sessions, shared dreams, and ultimate heartbreak. Then Violet looked away. She turned back to her cleaning with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to make herself invisible, to take up as little space as possible in a world that had made it clear she didn't belong. Her movements were careful, controlled, giving nothing away to the casual observer. But Albert knew her. Even after 18 months, he knew the subtle signs of her emotions. The way her shoulders tensed when she was fighting tears. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was nervous. The way she pressed her lips together when she was trying not to say something she'd regret. "Darling." Victoria's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts like a blade. She slipped her arm through his, her touch light and possessive. "I've been looking everywhere for you. Senator Morrison wants to discuss that infrastructure bill you were telling him about." Albert turned toward his wife, seeing her as if for the first time. Victoria was beautiful in the way of magazine covers and movie screens, every feature perfectly symmetrical, every curve precisely where it should be. Her smile was practiced and charming, her laugh musical and timed for maximum effect. She was everything Violet wasn't. Polished where Violet was natural. Calculated where Violet was spontaneous. Connected where Violet was alone. Pregnant and alone. Cleaning up after the party celebrating his marriage to another woman. "Albert." Victoria's brow furrowed with delicate concern. "You seem distracted. Is everything all right?" He looked back toward where Violet had been, but she was gone. Vanished back into the shadows where the invisible people worked, where the real world functioned behind the gleaming facade of his new life. "I'm fine," he heard himself say. "Just taking it all in." Victoria's smile returned, bright and satisfied. "It is rather overwhelming, isn't it? But good overwhelming. This is just the beginning, darling. Can you imagine what our life is going to be like? The places we'll go, the people we'll meet, the empire we'll build together." Empire. As if love was a territory to be conquered, a resource to be exploited. What would you do if you saw someone from your past at the worst possible moment? Have you ever had to choose between security and your heart? Tell us about a time when life forced you to confront your biggest regret. "Come," Victoria continued, tugging gently on his arm. "Let's not keep the senator waiting. You know how important these connections are for your next venture." Albert allowed himself to be led away, but every step felt like a betrayal. With each foot of distance he put between himself and the kitchen doors, the weight in his chest grew heavier. Senator Morrison was holding court near the bar, his booming laugh echoing across the ballroom as he regaled a small group with political war stories. He was the kind of man who filled every room he entered, demanding attention and deference with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned his right to either. "Albert." Morrison's voice carried the warmth of shared ambition. "There's the man of the hour. Congratulations, son. You've married well." The phrase hit Albert like a physical blow. Married well. As if Victoria was a stock that had performed above expectations. A merger that had exceeded projected returns. "Thank you, Senator," Albert replied automatically, shaking the older man's hand with the firm grip that had been drilled into him since childhood. "I was just telling Thompson here about your digital security platform," Morrison continued. "Fascinating stuff. The government applications alone could be worth, well, let's just say it could be very lucrative for everyone involved." The conversation continued around him, but Albert's mind was elsewhere. He was remembering another conversation, one that had taken place in this very hotel almost 2 years ago. He'd brought Violet here for dinner, wanting to show her the world he moved in, hoping she'd see that she belonged in it. They'd sat at a table overlooking the Sound, the setting sun painting the water in shades of gold and crimson. "It's beautiful," Violet had said, but there was something tentative in her voice. "Though I have to admit, I feel a little out of place." "You shouldn't," Albert had replied, reaching across the table to take her hand. "You belong anywhere I am." He'd meant it then. Every word. So what had changed? When had he started listening to other voices, other opinions about what his life should look like and who should be in it? "Isn't that right, Albert?" Senator Morrison's voice dragged him back to the present. "I'm sorry," Albert said, blinking back to focus. "Could you repeat that?" Victoria's laugh was light, but there was steel underneath it. "I think the groom is still recovering from the excitement," she said smoothly. "It's been such a whirlwind day." The group chuckled indulgently, and Albert forced himself to smile. But inside he was drowning. Every laugh, every congratulation, every celebration of his perfect marriage felt like another stone added to the weight dragging him under. Because somewhere in this building, the woman carrying his child was emptying trash cans and scrubbing floors for minimum wage, trying to survive in a world that had made it clear she didn't matter. And he was here, toasting his success with champagne that cost more than she probably made in a month. The reception continued around him in a blur of obligation and performance. He danced when expected, laughed when prompted, made conversation with people whose names he knew but whose lives remained completely foreign to him. But through it all, one thought pounded in his head like a drumbeat. Violet is here. Violet is pregnant. Violet needs help. And you're celebrating marrying someone else. As the evening wore on, Albert found himself scanning the crowd for any glimpse of her. He spotted other catering staff moving efficiently through the room, refilling champagne flutes, clearing plates, adjusting arrangements, but Violet remained conspicuously absent. Maybe that was for the best. Maybe it was better if she stayed hidden in the kitchen, out of sight and out of mind. Maybe he could pretend this night had never happened, that he'd never seen her, never had to confront the reality of what his choices had cost. Maybe he could go back to his carefully constructed life and pretend that love was supposed to feel this empty. But even as he tried to convince himself, Albert knew it was too late. The dam had broken. 18 months of suppressed guilt, regret, and longing came rushing back with the force of a tsunami. He'd spent all this time telling himself he'd made the right choice, the smart choice, the logical choice. He'd convinced himself that love wasn't enough, that compatibility meant more than passion, that building a life was about more than just how someone made you feel when they smiled. Seeing Violet tonight, pregnant, struggling, reduced to invisibility in a world where she'd once stood beside him as an equal, shattered every justification he'd built. The woman he'd loved more than his own life was carrying his child. And he'd just married someone else. As the thought hit him with full force, Albert excused himself from yet another conversation about market projections and headed toward the men's room. He needed air. He needed space. He needed to think. But mostly, he needed to figure out how to live with himself after tonight. Because one thing had become crystal clear in the space of a single shattering moment. He'd made the biggest mistake of his life. And now he had to decide if it was too late to fix it. The men's room of the Grand Meridian was as luxurious as everything else in the hotel. Marble countertops, gold fixtures, and soft lighting that was designed to make even the most stressed businessman look like he belonged in a boardroom. Albert gripped the edge of the sink, staring at his reflection in the ornate mirror. The man looking back at him was a stranger. Same green eyes, same strong jawline, same dark hair that cost $300 to cut and style. But there was something hollow in that reflection, something missing that had been there once upon a time. When had he become this person? This man who could stand in a room full of people celebrating his marriage while the woman he'd once planned to spend his life with cleaned up their mess from the floor? Albert splashed cold water on his face, trying to wash away the image of Violet on her knees, trying to scrub out the memory of that resigned look in her eyes. But the water just ran down his face like tears he refused to shed. His phone buzzed. A text from Victoria. "Where are you, darling? Mrs. Ashford wants to discuss the honeymoon plans with us both." Of course she did. Because their honeymoon, like everything else, was a production that required input from committees and approval from boards of directors. They were flying to the Ashford family estate in the Hamptons, then to their private island in the Caribbean. 3 weeks of carefully orchestrated relaxation, complete with photographers to document their marital bliss for society magazines. Albert typed back, "Be right there." But instead of returning to the reception, he found himself walking in the opposite direction, toward the service corridors that led to the kitchen. He told himself he just needed a few more minutes to compose himself, to get his head straight before facing the rest of the evening. He was lying to himself, and he knew it. The service hallway was a different world from the opulent ballroom. Here the walls were plain white, the lighting harsh and fluorescent. The sounds of the reception became muffled, replaced by the clatter of dishes, the hum of industrial refrigerators, and the sharp commands of kitchen staff trying to keep up with the demands of Seattle's elite. Albert had never been in the service areas of the Grand Meridian before. In his world, these spaces didn't exist. Food appeared, dishes disappeared. Problems were solved by invisible hands that never intruded on the perfect facade of wealth and privilege. Now, seeing the cramped quarters where the real work happened, he felt like an intruder in his own wedding venue. "Excuse me, sir," a young man in kitchen whites said, looking nervous at the sight of Albert's expensive tuxedo in their domain. "I don't think guests are allowed back here." "I'm looking for someone," Albert said. "One of the catering staff. Violet Washington." The young man's expression shifted, becoming carefully neutral. "I'm not sure I should. Please." The word came out rougher than Albert intended. "It's important." Something in his tone must have convinced the kitchen worker, because he pointed toward a loading dock at the far end of the corridor. "She's taking her break out there." "But sir, you really shouldn't." Albert was already walking away, his heart pounding against his ribs like a caged bird. Each step felt both inevitable and impossible, like walking toward the edge of a cliff he couldn't stop himself from approaching. The loading dock was a concrete platform overlooking an alley behind the hotel. The glamorous facade of the Grand Meridian didn't extend here. This was purely functional space, designed for deliveries and garbage removal, for the unglamorous necessities that kept luxury functioning. Violet sat on the edge of the platform, her legs dangling over the side, one hand resting on her rounded belly. She'd removed the catering jacket, revealing a simple white t-shirt that had seen better days. In the harsh light of the security lamps, she looked younger than her 28 years, and infinitely more fragile than the strong, vibrant woman he remembered. She heard his footsteps and turned, resignation flickering across her features before she looked away again. "You shouldn't be here, Albert," she said quietly. "Your guests will be wondering where the groom disappeared to." Albert stood frozen for a moment, drinking in the sight of her. Even exhausted, even wearing clothes that didn't fit properly, even with the weight of struggle written in the lines around her eyes, she was still the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. Violet. Her name was a prayer on his lips. God, I don't even know where to start." "Then don't." She shifted on the concrete ledge, and Albert caught a glimpse of her swollen ankles, the way she pressed her hand to her lower back. There's nothing to say that hasn't already been said. But there was everything to say. 18 months of words that had been swallowed, explanations that had never been given, apologies that had been practiced in front of mirrors but never spoken aloud. Albert took a step closer. "The baby. Is it yours?" Violet's laugh was bitter. "Did you really think I moved on that quickly after you destroyed my heart?" The words hit him like physical blows. Albert sank onto a wooden crate a few feet away, suddenly unable to support his own weight. "Violet, what happened between us?" "What happened," she interrupted, "is that you chose your mother's approval over our relationship. You chose your social circle over the woman who loved you. You chose a life that looked good on paper over a life that felt good in your heart." Each accusation was true, and each one cut deeper than the last. Albert had spent 18 months constructing elaborate justifications for his choices, building intellectual frameworks to explain why ending things with Violet had been the mature, responsible decision. Now, faced with the reality of what those choices had cost, every justification crumbled to dust. "I never meant for this to happen," he said weakly. "I never meant for you to end up pregnant and alone, working 3 jobs just to keep a roof over my head." Violet's voice remained steady, but Albert could see the tremor in her hands. "What exactly did you think would happen, Albert? Did you imagine I'd just disappear? That the life we built together would just evaporate? Have you ever had to face the real consequences of a choice you thought you could walk away from? Sometimes our decisions follow us in ways we never expected. What would you say to someone from your past who changed the course of your life?" Albert wanted to reach for her, to close the distance between them and somehow bridge the chasm that 18 months of silence had created. But he could see in her posture that she was barely holding herself together, that any show of tenderness from him would shatter whatever fragile composure she was maintaining. "How long have you been working here?" he asked instead. 3 months. Violet's hand moved in slow circles over her belly, an unconscious gesture that made Albert's chest ache. "Before that, I was cleaning offices downtown. Before that, I was stocking shelves at a grocery store. Turns out, having former girlfriend of Albert Whitmore on your resume doesn't open a lot of doors." The casual cruelty of it took Albert's breath away. He'd never considered how their breakup might have affected her professionally, how his world might have closed ranks against her after their relationship ended. "I didn't know," he whispered. "Of course you didn't. You were busy building your empire, weren't you? Making the right connections, attending the right parties, dating the right kind of woman." Violet's voice was steady, but there was an ocean of pain beneath the surface. "Tell me, Albert, does Victoria make you happy?" The question was so simple and so impossible to answer honestly that Albert felt like he was suffocating. Victoria made him comfortable. She made him look good at industry events. She understood his ambitions and supported his career goals. She knew how to navigate the complex social hierarchies of his world and never embarrassed him in front of important people. But happy? When was the last time Victoria had made him laugh until his sides hurt? When was the last time he'd lost track of time talking to her about dreams and fears and the million small thoughts that make up a life? When was the last time touching her had felt like coming home instead of performing a role? "She's a good fit for my life," Albert said finally. Violet's smile was heartbreaking in its sadness. "That's not what I asked." Before Albert could respond, the sound of voices echoed from the service corridor behind them. Someone was looking for him. Probably Robert, sent by Victoria to track down the missing groom. "You should go," Violet said, struggling to her feet. The movement was awkward, her pregnancy making even simple actions more difficult. "Your new wife will be wondering where you are." Albert stood as well, his body moving without conscious direction. They were only a few feet apart now, close enough that he could smell her familiar perfume underneath the industrial cleaning products, close enough to see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her hands shook just slightly with the effort of keeping herself composed, close enough to see that she was still wearing the necklace he'd given her for their first Christmas together. It was a simple silver chain with a small violet pendant, a joke about her name that had become something precious between them. He'd expected her to throw it away after their breakup, to erase every reminder of what they'd shared. But there it was, gleaming against her throat like a secret. "Violet," he started, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't contain. "Don't." She stepped back, putting distance between them. "Please, Albert. Just don't. I can't do this again. I can't survive having my heart broken by you twice." "Mr. Whitmore?" A voice called from the doorway. One of the hotel staff members appeared, looking relieved and flustered. "Sir, your wife is looking for you. She says it's urgent." Albert looked back at Violet, memorizing her face in the harsh light of the loading dock. This might be the last time he ever saw her, the last chance he had to say any of the things that had been eating him alive for 18 months. But what could he say? "I'm sorry. It wasn't enough. I love you. It was too late. I made a mistake. It couldn't be undone." "Go," Violet said again, and this time there was finality in her voice. "Go back to your perfect life, Albert. Forget you saw me here. Forget about all of this." She gestured vaguely at her belly, at herself, at the space between them that held 3 years of shared history and a future that would never be. "I could never forget you," Albert said, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. For just a moment, Violet's composure cracked. He saw the woman who'd once looked at him like he'd hung the stars, who'd believed in their future so completely that she'd started picking out names for children they'd planned to have together. Then she rebuilt her walls, brick by brick, until she was looking at him like a stranger again. "You already did," she said simply. "The moment you chose her over me, you forgot everything that mattered." Albert opened his mouth to argue, to explain, to somehow make her understand that it hadn't been simple, that he'd been pressured and manipulated and scared of disappointing the people who'd shaped his world. But the words died in his throat because he realized she was right. He had forgotten. Not the memories. Those had haunted him every day. But he'd forgotten what it meant to choose love over convenience, authenticity over acceptance, heart over head. He'd forgotten who he was when he was with her. "Sir." The hotel employee was growing more insistent. "Your wife really needs to speak with you." Albert nodded slowly, never taking his eyes off Violet. "I'll be right there." The staff member disappeared back into the corridor, but Albert didn't move. He couldn't. This felt like standing at the edge of the rest of his life, and he didn't know which direction to step. "Go, Albert," Violet said one final time. "Before we both say something we'll regret." But as Albert finally turned to leave, he realized that his biggest regret wasn't anything he might say to Violet. His biggest regret was everything he'd failed to say 18 months ago, when there had still been time to choose differently. When there had still been time to choose her. Albert walked back through the service corridor like a man in a trance, his expensive shoes echoing against the linoleum floors. Each step took him further from Violet and deeper into the glittering lie his life had become. By the time he reached the ballroom, his face had resumed its practiced mask of contentment, but inside, he was screaming. The reception was in full swing. The dance floor was crowded with couples swaying to a jazz quartet's rendition of "At Last," a song that had once meant something completely different to Albert. He remembered dancing to it with Violet in their tiny apartment kitchen, her bare feet on top of his, both of them laughing at how off-key they sang along. Now it felt like a mockery. "There you are." Victoria appeared at his side, her relief evident despite her bright smile. "I was starting to worry. Where did you disappear to?" "Just needed some air," Albert replied automatically, accepting the fresh whiskey someone pressed into his hand. The lie came so easily it frightened him. Victoria linked her arm through his, her touch light but possessive. "Well, you missed quite a bit. Judge Patterson was telling the most amusing story about his fishing trip to Alaska, and Mrs. Ashford has been making plans for our engagement party announcements in the Times." Engagement party announcements. For a marriage that had already happened. Albert realized with growing horror that his life had become a series of performances, each one requiring him to pretend a little harder, smile a little brighter, feel a little less. Also, Victoria continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially, Mother wanted me to mention that she's spoken to the catering manager about their staffing choices. Apparently, some of the help tonight aren't quite up to our usual standards. There was some concern about maintaining the proper atmosphere. Albert's blood turned to ice. What do you mean? Victoria's laugh was light and dismissive. Oh, you know how Mother is about these things. She noticed one of the cleaning girls looked rather unprofessional. Apparently, she's quite noticeably pregnant, which isn't exactly the image we want at an event like this. Mother asked to have her reassigned to somewhere less visible. The words hit Albert like physical blows. Less visible. As if Violet's pregnancy, his child, was something shameful to be hidden away. Which girl? Albert heard himself ask, though he already knew the answer. I didn't get her name, Victoria shrugged. Some girl with... Well, you know. One of them. Mother said she looked like she didn't belong anyway. Honestly, I don't know why the hotel can't screen their staff better for events like ours. One of them. The casual racism in Victoria's words, spoken so matter-of-factly, as if Violet's worth as a human being could be measured by the color of her skin and the designer label on her clothes, shattered something fundamental inside Albert. This was the woman he'd married. This was the life he'd chosen. This was the world he'd thought was worth losing Violet for. Albert excused himself and headed toward the bar, needing distance from Victoria's bright chatter before he said something that couldn't be taken back. But even across the room, he could hear fragments of conversation that made his skin crawl. Really, the help these days has no sense of propriety. In my day, pregnant women knew better than to work public events. Albert's new wife is lovely, so much more suitable than that last girl he was seen with. That last girl. As if Violet's 3-year relationship with Albert, the love they'd shared, the life they'd built together, could be dismissed as easily as changing clothes. Albert gripped his whiskey glass so tightly his knuckles went white. Around him, Seattle's elite continued their celebration, completely unaware that they were dancing on the grave of everything he'd once held sacred. You look like you could use some company. Robert appeared beside him, his expression concerned. You've been acting strange all night, Danny. What's going on? Albert stared into his drink, seeing Violet's reflection in the amber liquid. Do you remember her, Robert? Violet. Robert's expression shifted, becoming carefully neutral. Albert, I don't think this is the time. Do you remember her? Albert repeated, his voice harder. Robert sighed. Of course I remember her. She was good for you. Made you laugh more than I'd seen in years. Made you human. Then why didn't you stop me? When I was making the biggest mistake of my life, why didn't you tell me I was being an idiot? I tried, Robert said quietly. But you weren't listening. You were so focused on what everyone else expected, on building the right image, on making the right connections. You stopped hearing anything that didn't fit with the plan. The plan. Albert's mother's plan. His board of directors' plan. Society's plan for what a man in his position should want, should choose, should become. Everyone's plan except his own. She's here, Albert said suddenly. Robert nearly dropped his drink. What? Violet. She's here, working for the catering company. She's 7 months pregnant, Robert. 7 months. The math hung between them like a loaded gun. Robert's face went through a series of expressions. Shock, understanding, and finally, a kind of sad resignation. Jesus. Albert. What are you going to do? Before Albert could answer, A commotion near the kitchen doors caught their attention. Margaret Henderson was speaking loudly to someone, her voice carrying the authority of old money and absolute certainty. "I don't care what your personal circumstances are," she was saying. "This is a high-profile event, and we cannot have staff members who reflect poorly on the occasion. I'm afraid we'll have to terminate your employment immediately." Albert's vision went red around the edges. He could see Violet standing there, her shoulders straight despite the humiliation, her hand protectively over her belly. She was being fired. In front of everyone. For the crime of being pregnant and visible. For the crime of carrying his child. "Excuse me." Albert set down his glass and started walking toward the confrontation, his body moving with deadly purpose. "Albert, no," Robert grabbed his arm. "Think about what you're doing. Think about Victoria, about your reputation, about everything you'll be throwing away." Albert looked back at his best friend, and Robert must have seen something in his expression because he slowly let go. "Some things are worth throwing away," Albert said quietly. He walked across the ballroom like a man walking to his own execution. Conversations stopped as he passed. People turned to watch, sensing that something significant was happening but not yet understanding what. Victoria noticed the attention and followed his path with her eyes, her smile faltering as she realized he was heading toward the disturbance near the kitchen. "Mrs. Henderson," Albert said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet space. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Margaret Henderson turned, her face brightening with relief. "Oh, Albert. Perfect timing. I was just dealing with a staffing issue. Nothing for you to worry about." "Actually," Albert said, his eyes never leaving Violet's face, "I think it's very much something for me to worry about." Violet's eyes went wide with panic. She shook her head almost imperceptibly, silently pleading with him not to make this worse. But Albert was done making things worse by staying silent. "You see," he continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "the woman you're firing happens to be someone very important to me." The ballroom had gone completely silent now. Even the quartet had stopped playing, sensing the drama unfolding before them. "Albert," Violet whispered, "please don't do this." But Albert stepped closer to her, close enough that he could see the tears she was fighting to hold back, close enough to smell her familiar perfume beneath the industrial cleaning products. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, never taking his eyes off Violet, "I'd like you to meet Violet Washington, the mother of my child." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Albert heard Victoria's sharp intake of breath behind him, heard the collective gasp of 300 wedding guests, heard the crash of someone dropping a champagne flute. But all he could see was Violet's face, the way her eyes filled with tears and terror and something that might have been hope. "Albert, what are you doing?" Victoria's voice was sharp with panic and rising anger. Albert finally turned to face his wife of 4 hours, who was looking at him like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. Maybe sanity was overrated. "I'm telling the truth," he said simply. "Something I should have done a long time ago." Victoria's face was cycling through emotions. Shock, humiliation, rage. "You're having some kind of breakdown," she said, her voice tight with the effort of maintaining control. "The stress of the wedding, the alcohol. You're not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in 18 months, Albert replied. He turned back to Violet, whose face was pale with shock. "Violet, I know I have no right to ask this, but will you please give me a chance to explain?" "Explain?" Victoria's voice was rising, becoming shrill. "Explain what, Albert? That you've been lying to me? That you got some woman pregnant while we were engaged?" "I got her pregnant before I met you," Albert said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "Before I convinced myself that love wasn't enough. Before I chose status over substance. The crowd was starting to murmur now, a low buzz of shock and speculation that grew with each revelation. Albert. His mother's voice cut through the noise like a blade. Eleanor Whitmore approached with the regal bearing of someone who'd spent her life commanding respect and obedience. Stop this immediately. You're embarrassing yourself and everyone who matters. Everyone who matters. Albert looked at his mother, really looked at her for the first time in years. You mean everyone whose opinion affects our social standing? Everyone whose approval we need to maintain our position? I mean everyone whose respect you'll lose if you continue this spectacle, Eleanor replied coldly. Think about what you're doing, Albert. Think about your future. Albert looked around the ballroom at the faces surrounding him. Some showed shock, others disgust. A few looked almost entertained by the drama. These were supposed to be the people who mattered in his life, the ones whose opinions should guide his choices. But as he looked at them, Albert realized he didn't care what any of them thought. The only opinion that mattered was standing 20 feet away, pregnant with his child, wearing a catering uniform and fighting tears. My future, Albert said, loud enough for everyone to hear, is standing right there. He walked toward Violet, ignoring the gasps and murmurs behind him. When he reached her, he dropped to one knee on the marble floor of the Grand Meridian Hotel, in front of 300 witnesses, still wearing his wedding tuxedo. Violet, he said, his voice breaking with 18 months of suppressed emotion. I love you. I've loved you every day since you walked out of my life, and I'll love you every day until I die. I was a coward who chose other people's approval over your heart, and I will regret that choice for the rest of my life. Violet was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she looked down at him. Albert, you can't. You just got married. This is insane. What's insane, Albert said, is that I ever thought I could be happy without you. What's insane is that I let anyone convince me you weren't worth fighting for. He reached up and gently took her hands in his. They were rough from months of hard work, marked by struggles he should have been there to prevent. I can't undo the last 18 months, he continued. I can't give you back the time you spent working 3 jobs while carrying our child. I can't erase the humiliation you faced or the hardships you've endured because of my cowardice. Behind them, the ballroom erupted in chaos. Victoria was sobbing, his mother was issuing sharp commands to security, and 300 guests were witnessing the collapse of what was supposed to be the perfect wedding. But Albert only had eyes for Violet. What I can do, he said, is promise you that I will spend the rest of my life proving that you and our child are worth more to me than anything else in this world. I can promise you that I will never again choose comfort over courage, or status over love. Albert. Violet's voice was barely a whisper. Marry me, he said, the words torn from the deepest part of his soul. Not because it makes sense, not because it's practical, not because anyone expects it. Marry me because we love each other, because we're going to have a beautiful child together, because life is too short to waste on anything that isn't real. For a moment that felt like eternity, Violet looked down at him. Albert could see her weighing his words against 18 months of pain, measuring his promises against the reality of what choosing him would mean. Finally, she spoke. Get up, Albert, she said softly. Albert's heart stopped. He'd lost her. After everything, he'd finally found the courage to choose her, and it was too late. But then Violet smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her all night. Get up, she repeated, because I can't kiss you properly while you're on the floor. Albert stood slowly, his eyes never leaving Violet's face as the chaos of the ballroom swirled around them. The world had narrowed to just the two of them, to the space between his outstretched hands and her tear-streaked cheeks, to the moment when everything broken could finally begin to heal. When their lips met, it was like coming home after 18 months of being lost in the wilderness. Albert tasted salt from her tears and sweetness from her forgiveness, felt the soft warmth of her mouth against his, and remembered what it meant to be whole. The kiss lasted only seconds, but it contained 3 years of love, 18 months of regret, and a lifetime of promises he intended to keep. When they broke apart, the ballroom had erupted into complete pandemonium. Victoria was screaming at anyone who would listen, her perfect composure shattered beyond repair. This is humiliation. Absolute humiliation. I will not stand for this. Eleanor Whitmore was barking orders at hotel security, demanding they remove that woman immediately, while simultaneously trying to convince the gathered crowd that her son was having some kind of mental breakdown brought on by the stress of success. Senator Morrison looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant, already calculating how the scandal might affect his political alliances. Judge Patterson was shaking his head in disgust, muttering about the younger generation's complete lack of propriety. But there were other reactions too. Albert noticed Robert standing near the bar, a huge grin spreading across his face as he started a slow clap that gradually gained momentum. A few younger guests joined in, seemingly entertained by the dramatic turn of events. Even some of the catering staff had emerged from the kitchen to witness the spectacle, their faces showing a mixture of shock and admiration. Security! Eleanor's voice cut through the noise. Remove this woman immediately. No. Albert's voice carried with an authority he'd never used before, stopping the approaching security guards in their tracks. She's not going anywhere. He turned to face the crowd, still holding Violet's hand like a lifeline. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried to every corner of the ballroom. I know this isn't what any of you expected tonight, he said. I know this isn't the story you thought you'd be telling your friends tomorrow. But sometimes life gives you a moment where you can choose between what's easy and what's right, between what looks good and what feels true. He squeezed Violet's hand, drawing strength from her presence beside him. 18 months ago, I made the worst mistake of my life. I let other people's expectations convince me that love wasn't enough, that compatibility on paper mattered more than the connection of two souls. I chose what looked right over what felt right, and I've regretted it every single day since. Victoria had stopped screaming and was now staring at him with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. Albert, you can't seriously think. I think, Albert interrupted gently, that you deserve someone who loves you the way you deserve to be loved. And that someone isn't me. It never was, and I'm sorry it took me this long to admit it. The words were brutal in their honesty, but Albert delivered them with a kindness that somehow made them bearable. Victoria's face crumpled, but there was a flicker of something that might have been relief beneath the humiliation. The marriage will be annulled, of course, Albert continued, addressing the crowd but speaking to Victoria. I'll make sure you're taken care of financially, and I'll make sure everyone knows the fault lies entirely with me. Eleanor stepped forward, her face a mask of cold fury. Albert, if you walk away from everything we've built, everything your father worked for, everything Dad worked for was to give me the freedom to make my own choices, Albert said firmly. I'm finally making the right one. He turned back to Violet, who had remained silent through the entire confrontation, her hand steady in his despite the chaos surrounding them. Violet, he said softly, will you let me take you home? She nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Yes, she whispered. Please. Albert removed his tuxedo jacket and draped it over her shoulders, the expensive fabric dwarfing her small frame. Then, without looking back at the life he was leaving behind, he led her toward the exit. The crowd parted before them like water, some faces showing disgust, others curiosity, a few displaying what might have been admiration for his courage. Albert didn't care about any of them. His entire world had condensed to the woman beside him and the child she carried. Their child, who would grow up knowing that love had triumphed over convenience. As they reached the ballroom doors, Robert appeared beside them. "Need a ride?" he asked with a grin. "I have a feeling your limo driver might be getting some conflicting instructions." Albert clasped his friend's shoulder gratefully. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Robert replied. "Wait until you see the headlines tomorrow." 3 months later. The apartment Albert had bought for them wasn't much by his previous standards. A modest 2-bedroom in Capitol Hill, with hardwood floors that creaked and windows that sometimes stuck. But it was theirs, filled with laughter and morning coffee and the kind of comfortable silence that only comes when two people truly know each other. Violet had quit all 3 of her jobs the day after the wedding disaster, though not because Albert demanded it. She'd simply looked at him over breakfast and said, "I think it's time I went back to school. If you're really serious about this, about us, then I want to finish my degree." Albert had enrolled her at the University of Washington that afternoon, paying her tuition and buying her textbooks with the kind of joy most people reserved for winning the lottery. Watching her study social work at their kitchen table, her books propped around her growing belly, was better than any business success he'd ever achieved. The fallout from the wedding had been spectacular, just as Robert had predicted. The Seattle Times had run the story on the front page. "Tech billionaire abandons wedding for pregnant ex-girlfriend." The society pages had been merciless, painting Albert as either a romantic hero or a complete fool, depending on the publication's target audience. His mother hadn't spoken to him since that night. Victoria's family had threatened lawsuits that never materialized. Several business associates had distanced themselves from the scandal. Albert found he didn't care about any of it. His company stock had taken a hit initially, but recovered within weeks as investors realized that his personal drama didn't affect his ability to run a tech empire. If anything, the publicity had brought new attention to his security platform, with several major contracts signed by executives who admired his willingness to follow his heart. "You know," Violet said one evening as they lay in bed, her head on his chest and his hand resting on her belly, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm grateful you married Victoria." Albert tensed. "What?" Violet lifted her head to look at him, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "If you hadn't, you never would have seen me at the reception. We might have spent the rest of our lives apart, both of us too stubborn and hurt to reach out." "I would have found you eventually," Albert said, stroking her hair. "I was already going crazy missing you. It was only a matter of time before I broke down and called." "Maybe," Violet said, settling back against his chest. "But this way was much more dramatic. Our daughter is going to love this story when she's older." Our daughter. The words never failed to make Albert's heart race. They'd found out the baby's gender the week before, and Albert had cried in the ultrasound room like he'd never cried in his adult life. "What should we name her?" he asked, a question they'd been playfully debating for weeks. "I was thinking Rose," Violet said. "Rose Whitmore. Strong but beautiful, simple but elegant." Albert tested the name in his mind, imagining calling it across playgrounds and at graduation ceremonies. "Rose Whitmore," he repeated. "I love it." 6 months later. Rose Elizabeth Whitmore entered the world at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in September, screaming her displeasure at being evicted from her warm, dark sanctuary. Albert had never seen anything so beautiful in his life as his daughter's wrinkled, red face and tiny, grasping fingers. "She's perfect," he whispered, cradling her against his chest while Violet dozed in the hospital bed. "Absolutely perfect." Rose had Violet's dark skin and Albert's green eyes, with a head full of soft black curls that seemed to have a mind of their own. She was healthy and loud and completely uninterested in sleeping for more than 2 hours at a time, and Albert had never been more exhausted or more happy in his entire life. Robert visited the next day, bringing flowers for Violet and a pink teddy bear that was almost as big as the baby. "She's beautiful," he said, peering down at Rose in her hospital bassinet. "Looks just like her mom, thank God." "Hey," Albert protested with mock offense. "Trust me, man, that's a compliment to both of them." Eleanor Whitmore appeared in the doorway that afternoon, holding a small gift box and looking uncertain for the first time in Albert's memory. The months of silence between them had been painful, but Albert had refused to compromise on his choice. "May I come in?" she asked quietly. Albert looked at Violet, who nodded encouragingly despite her exhaustion. "Of course, Mom." Eleanor approached the bed slowly, her eyes fixed on the baby in Violet's arms. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than Albert had heard it in years. "She's beautiful," she said simply. "What's her name?" "Rose Elizabeth," Violet replied. Elizabeth for Albert's grandmother. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Albert's paternal grandmother had been the only person who'd ever been able to stand up to Eleanor, the only one who'd taught Albert that strength and kindness weren't mutually exclusive. "She would have loved that," Eleanor said. She held out the gift box to Violet. "This was hers. I thought Rose might like to have it someday." Inside the box was a delicate silver bracelet, sized for a baby's tiny wrist, engraved with the words, "Beloved daughter." "Thank you," Violet said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's beautiful." Eleanor stood there for a moment, looking lost and older than her 62 years. Finally, she spoke again. "I owe you both an apology," she said. "I was so focused on what I thought Albert's life should look like that I forgot to consider what would actually make him happy. I let my prejudices and my fear cloud my judgment, and I nearly cost my son the best thing that ever happened to him." She looked directly at Violet. "You make him better than he ever was without you. You make him complete. And I'm sorry it took me this long to see that. Sometimes the people we love most have to find the courage to choose happiness over expectation. Have you ever had to stand up for what truly matters to you, even when everyone else disagreed? Share your story about choosing love over fear. Your courage might inspire someone else." 1 year later. The wedding was nothing like the spectacle at the Grand Meridian. Albert and Violet exchanged vows in the backyard of their Capitol Hill home, surrounded by the people who truly mattered to them. Robert served as best man again, this time with genuine joy instead of polite obligation. Violet's sister Maya was her maid of honor, holding 8-month-old Rose during the ceremony. The guest list was small, maybe 40 people total. Albert's college friends, Violet's family, some co-workers from her new job at a non-profit that helped single mothers find housing and job training. Eleanor was there too, looking genuinely happy for the first time in years as she played grandmother to Rose. There were no photographers from society magazines, no ice sculptures or crystal chandeliers. The flowers were from Violet's garden, the music came from Robert's carefully curated playlist, and the cake was made by Violet's aunt, who'd been baking for church functions for 30 years. It was perfect. As they danced to their first song as husband and wife, at last again, but this time with its original meaning restored, Albert held Violet close and marveled at how different his life looked now. His company was more successful than ever, but he'd restructured it to allow for more family time. He coached Little League on weekends and attended every one of Rose's doctor appointments. He'd started a foundation that provided job training and childcare for single mothers, with Violet serving as its director. "Any regrets?" Violet asked as they swayed together in their backyard, their friends and family celebrating around them. Albert looked over at Rose, who was being bounced on Eleanor's knee while making the delighted gurgling sounds that had become the soundtrack to his daily happiness. He looked at their modest home, at the mismatched chairs they'd borrowed from neighbors for the reception, at the life they'd built together from honesty and hope and the kind of love that refused to be practical. "Only one," he said, spinning Violet gently. "I regret that it took me so long to realize that you were always the only choice that mattered." Violet smiled, the same radiant smile that had captivated him 5 years ago in a coffee shop downtown. Well, she said, we have the rest of our lives to make up for lost time. As the sun set behind the Seattle skyline, painting their small backyard in shades of gold and crimson, Albert Whitmore held his wife and watched their daughter play with her grandmother, and knew with absolute certainty that he had finally chosen correctly. Love, it turned out, was always enough. You just had to be brave enough to choose it.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.